Welcome back to This Week in Racing, and in case you're curious, I've got the 49ers over the Chiefs 35-28. But I've got 2 weeks to make up for in This Week in Racing because, of course, last weekend I was at the Rolex 24 at Daytona, and that kind of took precedence over the news show. So I got some things to talk about from last week as well as this week. But first and foremost, I think this week really in particular, at least in the racing community, obviously we know about Kobe Bryant dying in the helicopter crash on Sunday last weekend, but the racing world suffered a pretty significant loss yesterday with John Andretti, who lost his life or his long battle with colon cancer. Now, John Andretti didn't have the most wins, but he was an incredibly versatile racing driver. In fact, he was the only driver to compete in an NHRA, NASCAR, sports car, and an IndyCar all in the same season. And I didn't know John personally, but everybody who has had any interaction with John Andretti would tell you that he was one of the kindest people in racing. And I can tell you, some of my most cherished memories of John were buying his Hot Wheels Pro Racing STP 43 at Kroger downtown in my hometown, and more recently, especially during his IndyCar comeback in the late 2000s, there were some really incredible moments. I remember when he raced at Iowa for Marty Roth's team, completely blank white car. He charged up from the back of the field and would look like a potential race winner that day. But I think maybe one of his greatest achievements, at least later on in racing, was the 2011 Indianapolis 500. And a lot of people forget this, but I do like to point it out to folks because John Andretti was the only Andretti Autosport car, and I think they had 5, 6, or 7 entries. It was a big number. But John Andretti was the only driver on that team who was able to qualify for the field safely. Everybody else, including Danica Patrick, Ryan Hunter-Reay, Marco Andretti, struggled to make the show. Not John. John did not struggle to make the Indy 500 when his teammates did. And I just that was a standout moment for me. But outside of the cockpit, John Andretti was a very charitable man, and in fact used his own condition to start a movement called Check It for Andretti, which I will certainly plug here because I think if you're over the age of 50, you should absolutely be going to get a colonoscopy to make sure that you don't end up suffering the same fate that unfortunately befell John. So I think for everybody that is watching this video and across the world of motorsports, we pay tribute to the late John Andretti. Heading into the news, we've got some things to catch up on from last week, particularly some IndyCar signings. Santino Ferrucci was finally confirmed at Dale Coyne Racing with the Vassar Sullivan organization, the number 18, the Sealmaster car, last week. That was something that had been, for some reason, unconfirmed for the longest time, which created a little bit of speculation as to where exactly Santino Ferrucci was going to end up, but he has finally been confirmed in the former seat of Sebastian Bourdais, and we will be seeing how his development continues, especially now that he's lost his engineer, Michael Kanaan, to Ganassi. Charlie Kimball confirmed that he will be racing full-time with AJ Foyt Racing in next year's IndyCar Series. It'll be car number 4. The sponsor, Novo Nordisk, a primary sponsor for several races throughout the season, but an associate for the rest of them. But it is a full season operation for Charlie Kimball, and as we will talk about later in this video, that leaves it pretty obvious where the rest of the AJ Foyt team will end up for next year. Pretty big news for the Indy 500 entry list, but not really much of a surprise. Fernando Alonso has parted ways with McLaren. This was something that was rumored in the summer of last year, but clearly they both entities waited till the end of their contract to have an amicable parting of the ways. Obviously, I think the relationship was kind of at its last leg with the failure to qualify at Indianapolis last year, and clearly McLaren have gone in their own direction, not only with the IndyCar program, but also on the Formula One side of things. Now, there were some pretty heavy rumors at the end of this week that the Andretti deal for the Indianapolis 500 involving Fernando Alonso driving has all but finished. So I'm sure we are going to hear a confirmation on that in the coming weeks. This was something that I reported on as it happened on the channel last week, but I figured I'd mention it here in This Week in Racing for those of you who were not tuned in to those videos. Prototype convergence. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means there is a common prototype formula that will be eligible to race in both the World Endurance Championship and the IMSA WeatherTech Sports Car Championship for overall wins. The new category is called LMDh, which stands for Le Mans Daytona, and then the H they have left undefined, though I speculate it's hybrid, other people speculate hypercar, and even Jim France himself said it stood for hydrogen, which was interesting. Regardless, this should mean that the American teams will be able to go over to the 24 Hours of Le Mans and race for the overall win. Now, one of the things that I thought was going on at the time, but apparently is still up in the air, are whether or not the WEC hypercars, which would include Toyota and Aston Martin, would be able to race in the United States races like the 24 Hours of Daytona, or would the hypercars be exclusively a WEC formula and then they would be balanced to race with the LMDh cars. A lot of things, a lot of questions up in the air that we will have answered when there is a joint press conference at the 12 Hours of Sebring to start talking about some technical regulations. Daniel Suarez has finally been confirmed at Gaunt Brothers Racing. Not really a surprise, but the key is that they tried to get a charter and were unable to. Therefore, at each of the 36 races this year for the NASCAR Cup Series, Daniel Suarez will be an open agent. He will have to qualify for each of the races. I guess that will at least mean that the Daytona duels will be interesting from the perspective that, hey, there's a NASCAR Xfinity champion, a recent one at that may not make the field. Chevrolet has announced that they will enter their C8R at the Sebring 1,000 kilometers for the World Endurance Championship. That, of course, is the joint event that runs incongruent with the 12 Hours of Sebring. They entered that event last year with a C7R, but it also adds to their workload because they are also entered at the COTA round of the World Endurance Championship. So really, the Corvette is getting quite a workout in the pre-Le Mans sports car world. But honestly, if you're debuting a new car and in this kind of new age where testing is tougher and tougher to come by, it makes a lot of sense that you would enter the Corvette in as many races as are convenient. Lawrence Stroll has bought a majority share in Aston Martin, which means several things. It means that Aston Martin will be financially saved for at least the foreseeable future, and it also means Racing Point's Formula One team, which Stroll also owns, will become Aston Martin Racing. That'll be something to look forward to in the coming months, and it also raises some questions about where the hypercar program, which was a joint venture between Red Bull and Aston Martin, will stand going forward. Now, there were some questions of development on that car, but Red Bull and Aston Martin have said they are steadfast in that relationship, according to SportsCar365.com. But I suppose the question still remains whether or not that car will still make it to the grid at all. So we're just going to have to kind of keep track of it as it goes along. And finally, Xfinity for the NASCAR series will be using the IndyCar layout of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway road course when they race there in July. That is a 14-turn layout. Many of us, including myself, I will gladly call out my bias here, wanted to see the 12-turn Formula One style layout with the full backwards turn one of the oval. That is not what they've decided to use after testing with Matt DiBenedetto to try to see what was compatible and what was not. They determined that the one with the oval turn was not compatible, and therefore they will race on the traditional, now Indy GP course. Just what you wanted, right? More stage changes. NASCAR is changing the stages for this year, but don't fret, they could have changed it even worse. According to AutoWeek's Matt Weaver, the Daytona 500 will essentially now be split into thirds with 65-lap segments instead of 60-lap segments before the final stage of the race. Now, it could have gotten worse, believe it or not. NASCAR was considering moving to 4 stages this year, but have determined, since the fact that there is an unknown quantity next year with the brand new chassis, there's a question of what the racing will be like and whether they should break out an extra, for lack of a better term, gimmick this year rather than wait till next year and give the fans something to look forward to. Oh boy. So I do want to talk about this a little bit because I don't think it's really a secret that I'm not a fan of the stage racing in NASCAR. And a lot of people seem to get confused by that because they're like, well, you don't like that they award points in the middle of the race. Of course not. That's not my bone of contention. I think awarding points in the middle of the race isn't a terrible idea, especially if you're aiming for some entertainment value in the middle of the race. The problem, of course, that I have is the race manipulation that is calling a caution in the middle of the race that's completely arbitrary. And, you know, I could understand if NASCAR, and they clearly have understood and realized that they've got a problem with the racing, with the package, with the cars. And you could justify stages to me or stage cautions to me if you're saying, look, we've got an unfixable problem. We've got a new car coming in 2021, and we'll reevaluate when we get there. I thought, or at least in the logical part of my brain, I would have thought at the very worst, stages would be, hey, this is a Band-Aid for bad racing, and hopefully when we have a new car, we'll fix a lot of the inherent problems with the current ones. Unfortunately, it seems like the opposite is taking place here. And they've gone, again, this is what it seems like to me. It seems like they looked at the problems that they had with the current car, they tried to fix them, and it doesn't seem like, at least according to that article in AutoWeek, that they're particularly confident that the changes they have made are actually going to solve the issues that the current Gen 6 formula has. If it doesn't, their solution is to add another stage to the race. I'm sorry. That just... It's profoundly baffling to me that this is considered acceptable. I'm surprised that the fans haven't revolted, to be honest with you. And I guess in a lot of ways, I mean, it's a placebo, isn't it? It's because, and I don't want to be so cynical to say this is why it is, but this is probably why it is. I mean, let's face it. The more cautions you're able to throw in a race, the more the cars are going to be close together and bunched up, and the more chances you have for accidents or cars getting into each other or people getting their tempers rising. And then, you know, even if you don't get a bunch of wrecks and extra yellows and dramatic things that way, hey, maybe somebody runs into somebody on a stage restart and they come into the pits and they have a fight. Like... But I think part of the problem, and this is something I've wanted to talk about for a while, and I've kind of asked some harder core NASCAR fans than me about this, is I asked them about this year's championship race. And I was like, how much did you actually care about that? And so many people were just telling me how kind of indifferent they were to last year's Homestead race. And I think a lot of it has to do with this kind of manipulation of the product, you know, trying so hard to create these moments all of the time. In a lot of ways, some of these things become less special. So it disappoints me quite a bit to see NASCAR continue to go down this path that is like, well, we can't fix the cars. So instead of trying to fix that, which seems to be the fundamental problem in all of this, which you would think a Gen 7 car would fix, instead, you just add an extra caution to the race that's mandatory. So in conclusion about the big dumb stages, don't like them, think they're race manipulation. I wish NASCAR would find a better solution than stopping the race to try to create artificial drama. Clear? Clear. And we wrap up the show by celebrating a legend. Tony Kanaan has announced his farewell tour to IndyCar racing with an oval-only season racing for AJ Foyt. Now, he wanted to run the full season, but funding did not allow for that. But here's the thing for Tony Kanaan fans. He has left the door open to continue to run the Indy 500 past this year. So there is some hope to continue to see TK running Indy cars. Now, I wanted to just talk about Tony Kanaan here for just a little bit, because in a lot of ways, Tony is like, I don't want to say this, I don't mean this as to be hyperbolic, but in a lot of ways, he's like this generation's AJ Foyt or Mario Andretti, or, you go further ahead and you say like Michael Andretti or Alonso Jr., he is that kind of transcendent star. He's a huge draw, especially at Indianapolis. The crowd absolutely adores him, and it's not often where you see a driver like this with the career longevity that he's had. So we should absolutely be celebrating it for this year at all of the oval races. Tony Kanaan's own career, especially at the Indy 500, is actually kind of intertwined with my being a fan. His first Indy 500 was also my first Indy 500, and his race unfortunately ended right in front of me when Bruno Junqueira blew an engine and he ran through some oil and got in the wall. But, there weren't many better moments than seeing Tony Kanaan get the Indianapolis 500 win in 2013, and he damn near, he was one tire failure away in 2018 from winning in his first race with AJ Foyt for the Indy 500. And there's always a possibility that he could do that again. It's fairly unlikely. A lot of people are asking what will happen with that car the rest of the year. It seems like there's some deal that's kind of been heavily rumored but not confirmed, that Sebastian Bourdais and Dalton Kellett will split that car for the rest of the road courses. And then I would assume, this is total speculation on my part, that AJ will enter a third car at the 500. Probably for Kellett, but possibly for Bourdais. We'll have to see how that all goes. But yeah, it's amazing to see Tony Kanaan's career as a full-time, or at least a driver that's outside of the Indy 500, coming to an end. Obviously with some of the other news this week, that's kind of, at least Tony's still around. But it's definitely one of those things that we need to sit back and take in, because it is a pretty big deal in the grand scheme of things. Again, I would love to see Tony Kanaan find some success this year and kind of move off of that gateway podium that he had last year, and possibly that Indy 500 run he had in 2018, because I think a lot of people write him off, but I would like to point out that a lot of the teams that he has left recently, look what happened with their setups, especially on the ovals. But anyway, thank you guys so much for watching This Week in Racing. Thank you for all the Patreon supporters. This was your first episode where you got to see your name at the bottom, so I hope you enjoyed that. Excited for February. Got some iRacing. Hopefully going to be traveling to a couple more at the track events. Still need to kind of finalize those things before I can announce them formally, but it's exciting times for this channel. I'm glad you guys are around with me. So thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.